The transmission arrived at 0347 UTC on a Tuesday. Not a Tuesday anyone would remember for its weather or its politics or its market movements. A Tuesday that would later be entered into every major historical archive under a single designation, Contact Day 1. The signal originated from a point approximately 4.2 light-hours beyond the heliopause, the boundary where solar wind fades and interstellar space truly begins. It was narrow beam, precisely targeted at Earth's primary deep space listening array in the Atacama Desert, and it carried a mathematical handshake so elegant that 3 separate teams independently confirmed its artificial origin within 11 minutes. Dr. Yael Ostrander, lead xenolinguist at the ESA's First Contact Preparedness Division, was the first human being to read the translated header. She read it twice. Then she picked up a secure line and called the UN Secretary General. "It's a summons," she said. "Not a greeting. A summons." The Galactic Council, as the translation software rendered their self-designation, though the literal meaning was closer to the continuance of ordered species, was old. Old in the way geological formations are old. Old in the way that makes human civilization feel like a footnote scratched in the margin of a textbook no one bothers to read anymore. They had been monitoring humanity for approximately 340 years by their own account. They had watched the steam engine. They had watched the atomic flash over Hiroshima. They had watched the Voyager probes drift into their territory like messages in bottles. And they had made a collective decision, consistent with what their diplomatic protocols called the threshold doctrine. Do not intervene until a species reaches functional interstellar capability, or until that species poses a measurable risk to established order. Humanity apparently had just crossed one of those thresholds. The summons was direct. The Council demanded that humanity submit a full accounting of its military capabilities, its territorial ambitions, and its governing frameworks within 30 standard cycles, roughly 42 Earth days. Failure to comply would result in what the translation rendered, somewhat disturbingly, as corrective engagement. There was no preamble. No "we come in peace." No formal introduction. Just the summons, a list of demanded disclosures and a deadline. Ambassador Kenji Adeyemi was not a soldier. He had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, most of it in post-conflict reconstruction and multilateral disarmament frameworks. He was calm in rooms where other people lost their composure. He had a reputation for reading between lines that other negotiators didn't even know existed. He read the Council's transmission 6 times before he said anything to his team. "They've done this before," he said finally. His deputy, Commander Lena Voss, on secondment from the European Defense Consortium, nodded. "The phrasing. It's procedural. They're not curious about us. They're processing us." "Which means," Adeyemi said, "they already believe they know the outcome." He set the translation tablet down on the conference table. Outside the window, Santiago's evening skyline glittered in the high desert dark. Somewhere above them, past the atmosphere, past the moon, past the cold geometry of the outer planets, something was watching and waiting for humanity to respond like every other species before it had. "Then let's make sure," Adeyemi said quietly, "that we give them something they didn't model." The decision about how to respond to the Council was not made by any single government. That was the first thing that surprised the Council's observers, who reviewed every human diplomatic transmission and found themselves unable to identify a singular decision-making authority. A joint emergency session of the UN Security Council was convened within 6 hours of the signal's authentication. Within 18 hours, it had expanded to include the African Union, the Pacific Cooperation Alliance, and every space-capable nation on Earth. Within 36 hours, there were representatives from 141 countries in the room, physically and virtually. They argued loudly in 17 languages across 17 time zones. That argument, the noise and the contradiction and the unresolved tension of it, was itself a piece of data the Council had not anticipated. Most species, when contacted, unified immediately. Fear produced consolidation. The Council's models were built on that pattern. Humanity argued for 9 days straight. And then on the 10th day they agreed. The response transmission was composed by a committee of 12, 4 diplomats, 3 military strategists, 2 linguists, a physicist, an ethicist, and a historian. It was reviewed by heads of state, revised 17 times, and ultimately approved by a margin that surprised even its authors. It was not aggressive. It was not submissive. It was, in the precise diplomatic vocabulary that Adeyemi had spent a career developing, calibrated. The transmission acknowledged the Council's existence. It acknowledged receipt of the summons. It stated, clearly and without embellishment, that humanity recognized the Council's seniority in interstellar affairs and had no territorial claims beyond its own solar system. And then it said something no species had ever said to the Galactic Council in its 4,000-year history. It said, "We will not be disclosing our military capabilities as a condition of dialogue. We are willing to discuss mutual security frameworks, bilateral verification protocols, and the terms of a formal recognition treaty. However, we do not respond to ultimatums." The transmission ended with a counterproposal: a direct diplomatic summit, neutral location, open agenda. In the Council's deliberation chamber, a vast temperature-controlled space aboard their primary diplomatic vessel, currently positioned just beyond Neptune's orbital path, there was what an observer might describe as a long silence. The Veth delegate, whose species had served as the Council's primary diplomatic arm for centuries, reviewed the human response 3 times. "They declined," said the Mora representative, whose people had never, in 11,000 years of recorded history, declined a council summons. "They counterproposed," the Veth delegate corrected. "Is there a difference?" The Veth delegate considered this carefully. In 4,000 years of first contact management, they had processed 61 species. 44 had complied immediately. 12 had resisted and been, eventually, corrected. 5 had negotiated from a position of acknowledged weakness and been incorporated into associate status. None had ever responded with a counterproposal that implicitly treated the Council as an equal party to a negotiation rather than an authority issuing a directive. "Pull up everything we have on their military history," the Veth delegate said. The archive responded. It was extensive. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. The Council had catalogued 61 species. They had a model for every kind of fear, every kind of defiance, every kind of surrender. They did not have a model for this. They assumed it was a bluff. They were already wrong. The Veth delegate's name, rendered in the closest human phonetic approximation, was something like Seth Ravel. She had held her position for 212 standard years, the equivalent of roughly 190 Earth years, and in that time she had overseen the processing of 11 new species into the Council's framework. She was not easily unsettled. She was unsettled now. The human military archive that the Council's intelligence division had compiled over 3 centuries of passive observation filled what the translation software rendered as 47,000 indexed volumes. Not metaphorical volumes. Actual structured data sets, each the informational equivalent of a major academic library, organized by conflict, period, technology level, and, this was the detail that kept pulling her attention, outcome reversal frequency. Outcome reversal frequency was a metric the Council's analysts had developed specifically for humanity, because no other species in their database had required it. It measured how often a species that appeared to be losing a conflict had subsequently won it. For the average Council member species, the figure hovered between 3 and 7%. Comebacks happened, but they were statistical anomalies, usually attributable to external factors: resource windfalls, disease among the opposing force, environmental disruption. For humanity, across 6,000 years of recorded warfare, the figure was 31%. Nearly 1 in 3 conflicts that humanity appeared to be losing, they eventually won. The analyst who had compiled the report was a Mora by species. Meticulous, methodical, deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. His name translated roughly as precision in counting, which was either a name or a job description depending on your perspective. He presented his findings to the Council's inner chamber with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a diagnosis they weren't entirely sure how to interpret. "The pattern is consistent across periods," he said. "Pre-industrial, industrial, early atomic, early spacefaring. The specific mechanisms change: tactical adaptation, technological improvisation, coalition building, resource mobilization. But the underlying behavioral signature is stable." "Which is?" asked the Veth delegate. "They do not recalibrate their strategic objectives when facing disadvantage. Most species, including our own, tend to revise objectives downward under sustained military pressure. Seek compromise. Reduce territorial ambitions. The humans?" He paused, visibly searching for precise language. "They tend to intensify. Not recklessly, but persistently." A third Council member, the Dururan representative, whose species controlled 7 systems in the galactic midrim, made a sound that translated as skepticism. "All species have anomalous data points in their histories. You're describing determination. Every species has determination." "With respect," the analyst said, "I'm describing something more specific. I'm describing a species that, on multiple documented occasions, converted near-certain defeat into eventual victory by extending the time horizon of the conflict beyond what their opponents had modeled. They didn't win quickly. They won longer. The specific case studies were instructive. The first one the analyst flagged was not a space battle or a futuristic confrontation. It was an island chain, a 70-year-old war, a naval engagement in the Pacific Ocean of Earth's 20th century. A force that had been tactically outmaneuvered, its primary strategic assets destroyed in a single morning, had reorganized, adapted its industrial base, developed new weapon systems, built new alliances, and defeated the attacking force less than 4 years later. The second case study was older, a continental war in which one of Earth's largest empires, fighting simultaneously on two major fronts, had held its position against a technologically and numerically superior opponent for 3 years before conditions shifted and the tide reversed. The third was more recent and more relevant to the Council's current situation, humanity's early spacefaring period, when two competing governmental blocs had poured resources into orbital infrastructure and deep space exploration under conditions of mutual deterrence so precisely calibrated that neither had ever actually fired a shot. They had spent 40 years building weapons they never used, and in doing so had developed a technological base that the Council's analysts estimated was approximately 60 years ahead of where it would have been without the adversarial pressure. They used threat as a developmental accelerant, the analysts said. The more serious the threat, the faster they develop. The chamber was quiet again. Ambassador Adeyemi, meanwhile, was not sleeping much. His team had set up a working facility inside a former European Space Agency complex outside Leiden, Netherlands, chosen for its secure communications infrastructure and its proximity to the primary deep space relay array. The facility had been staffed within 72 hours with a mix of diplomats, military advisors, linguists, scientists, and, somewhat unusually, historians. The historians had been Adeyemi's specific request. Every negotiation has a precedent, he had said in his briefing. Even if it's not a human precedent. I want people in this room who understand how power behaves when it believes itself to be superior. Dr. Amaran Kosi, professor of colonial and post-colonial political theory at the University of Cape Town, had taken a leave of absence the same day she received the call. She had spent the first 3 days reading every translated fragment of Council communication that the linguistics team could provide. On the 4th day she came to Adeyemi with a single handwritten page of notes. They've done this 61 times, she said. And every time, based on the phrasing, the procedural structure, the implied timeline, they've assumed the contacted species would either comply or demonstrate resistance in a way that confirmed their threat assessment. And if neither? There's no record of neither. She tapped the page. They've never encountered a species that responded to a summons with a counterproposal framed as diplomatic equivalence. Because every species they've contacted either didn't have the confidence to do it, or had the confidence but not the restraint. Adeyemi looked at her. We have both. That's what the transmission implied. She paused. The question is whether we can actually back it up. The Council requested a 48-hour extension on their response timeline. Internally this was unprecedented. Externally they framed it as procedural. Their intelligence division spent those 48 hours running simulations. The simulations required a variable that none of their standard models included. They called it, in their own terminology, something that translated approximately as non-rational persistence coefficient, a measure of how long a species would continue to resist past the point where resistance was statistically rational. For every species in their database, that coefficient was calculable from behavioral history. There was always a ceiling. A point at which the math of survival overrode the psychology of resistance. For humanity, every simulation they ran produced the same result. The coefficient didn't have a ceiling. Or if it did, they couldn't find it in 6,000 years of data. The Council had built their authority on a simple premise, that every species, when faced with sufficient power, would eventually calculate the cost of resistance and choose survival. It was a reasonable premise. It had worked 61 times. The 62nd species had a different relationship with cost-benefit analysis. And in 48 hours, the Council would have to decide what to do about that. The neutral location took 3 weeks to negotiate. The Council proposed 3 sites, all of them in deep space, all of them aboard Council-controlled vessels, all of them requiring humanity to travel to the meeting under conditions that would leave the human delegation effectively isolated and dependent on Council life support systems. Adeyemi rejected all 3 without extended deliberation. He counterproposed a location approximately halfway between Earth and the Council's current position, a point in space with no strategic value, no existing infrastructure, and no prior claim by either party. He proposed that both delegations arrive in equivalent vessels, that life support be independently maintained by each party, and that the summit facility be a jointly constructed temporary structure, assembled in real time by both parties' engineering teams over a period of 72 hours before the talks began. The engineering requirement was not accidental. If their people and our people have to build something together before the talks begin, Adeyemi explained to his team, it changes the psychology of the room before anyone sits down. Commander Voss, who had initially been skeptical of the joint construction idea on pure security grounds, came around to it after watching the first footage of the assembly crews working in adjacent sections of the orbital framework. The council engineers, Mora primarily with their extraordinary precision and their methodical approach to structural problems, kept pausing to observe the human crews. Not because the humans were doing anything wrong. Because they were doing it differently. Faster in some phases, more improvisational, communicating in bursts of informal shorthand that the Council's universal translation systems kept rendering as technically ambiguous. The Mora engineers filed 3 reports about it. All 3 concluded that the human construction methodology was less optimal in theory and approximately equivalent in practice. What they couldn't model was why it worked as well as it did. The summit facility, when completed, was a functional but unremarkable pressurized structure roughly the size of a large conference center. It had 2 main chambers, a shared neutral space, and at Adeyemi's specific insistence, no visual representation of either party's military assets anywhere in the facility. No uniforms with insignia. No displayed weapons. No imagery of fleets or territorial maps. He had made this clear in the pre-summit protocol documents. We are not here to demonstrate power. We are here to establish whether dialogue is possible. The Council's delegation was led by Seth Ravel, the VETH delegate. She arrived with 4 advisors, a Mora analyst, a Dururan security specialist, a legal framework expert from a species humanity had no prior knowledge of, and a xenopsychologist whose role, Adeyemi suspected, was to read the human delegation in real time. He had brought his own. Dr. Nkosi sat 2 seats to his left. Her role was officially listed as Historical Context Advisor. Her actual role was to watch the Council delegation and tell Adeyemi, through a discreet earpiece, what she was observing. Her first message 40 seconds into the opening exchange was, "They expected us to be more nervous." Seth Ravel opened with what the translation rendered as a formal acknowledgement of humanity's provisional standing in galactic community, a phrase that the Council's framework used to describe species that had not yet been formally classified. It was, by their standards, a polite opening. It implied neither hostility nor acceptance. Adeyemi responded by acknowledging the Council's long history and its evident role in maintaining stability across multiple star systems. He used specific language, evident role, not authority, not dominion, that implied recognition without concession. Nkosi's voice in his ear, she noticed. She paused 1.3 seconds before continuing. That's significant for a species that communicates at their speed. The first session lasted 6 hours. It covered procedural frameworks, translation verification, and the basic structure of what would constitute a formal recognition treaty versus a provisional dialogue agreement. Nothing was agreed. Nothing was rejected. What happened, slowly and without drama, was that both parties established that the other was capable of sustained, sophisticated diplomatic engagement. This was not as small a thing as it sounds. The Council had processed 61 species. The majority of those first sessions had been far shorter, far simpler, and far more one-sided. This was the first session in Council history that had required them to adjust their talking points twice before the midpoint break. The break lasted 40 minutes. Adeyemi ate a meal from his own supply, another deliberate protocol choice, removing any dependency on Council hospitality, and reviewed notes with Nkosi and Voss. "They have a framework they want us to sign," Voss said. "I can see it in how they keep returning to provisional standing. They want us in an associate category. Observed but not threatening. Contained. Which we won't accept," Adeyemi said. "Which we won't accept. But here's what I don't know. What do they do if we don't? They clearly expected compliance. They don't have a clear plan B." Nkosi looked up from her notes. "They have plan B. They just haven't decided to use it yet. The security specialist, the Dururan, he's been running calculations on a secondary tablet since the session began. He's assessing something. Our fleet?" Adeyemi asked. "Or our willingness to use it?" She paused. "I think they're trying to determine if the non-compliance is cultural or tactical. Whether it's how we actually think or whether we're performing confidence we don't have." Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. Then we should make sure, he said, that by the end of today the answer is obvious. The afternoon session shifted in a way that Seth Ravel later described, in her personal record of the event, as disorienting. The human lead negotiator had spent the morning responding. Careful, measured, reactive. Technically fluent but positionally conservative. She had read this as the normal behavior of a species feeling out unfamiliar territory. In the afternoon he began to lead. He introduced a framework, the Mutual Observation Compact, that he described as an alternative to the Council's provisional standing classification. It proposed a period of bilateral observation, rather than unilateral Council monitoring, during which both parties would refrain from military posturing in the other's territory, establish formal communication protocols, and work toward a recognition framework based on demonstrated non-aggression rather than compliance with Council-imposed categories. It was, Seth Ravel recognized, almost entirely reasonable. It was also completely outside any framework the Council had previously encountered. Because it didn't ask for the Council's approval. It offered the Council a choice. There is a specific kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. When Ambassador Adeyemi finished presenting the Mutual Observation Compact, there were 11 seconds of silence in that orbital chamber. 11 seconds is a very long time when every species in the room communicates faster than humans do. The Council had arrived expecting a species that would, eventually, comply. They were beginning to understand that they had arrived at the wrong expectation. 18 days after the summit ended without a signed agreement, but also without a breakdown, the Council made its first real move. It was subtle. Deliberately so. 3 Council-affiliated vessels moved into the outer solar system. Not into Earth's orbital sphere. Not close enough to be an act of naked provocation. They positioned themselves just beyond the Kuiper Belt, in a region that had no legal status under any human framework because no human framework had ever needed to address the question of who owned the outer boundary of their own solar system. The message was implicit rather than stated: we can be here. What will you do about it? At Unispace Command, the Joint Military Coordination Center that had been established specifically to interface with the Council situation, Commander Voss watched the telemetry data come in and felt the particular cold clarity of a moment she had been preparing for without fully believing would arrive. They're not in a defensive posture, said Admiral Huang Jintao, commander of the newly consolidated Earth Defense Coordination Fleet, reading the same data. The configuration is observation-oriented. They're watching to see how we respond. They want to know if our non-compliance at the summit was strategic or structural, Voss said. If it was strategic, if we were playing a negotiating game, we'll overreact. Make demands. Issue warnings we can't enforce. And if it was structural? She looked at the display. Then we respond proportionately. And they learned something about us they didn't know before. The debate about how to respond lasted 16 hours and involved heads of state, military chiefs, and the full diplomatic team. It was a genuine debate. There were serious voices arguing for a formal protest transmission, a demand for withdrawal, and a public statement establishing the solar system as sovereign human territory under an emergency declaration. The political pressure was real. The Council's presence, even at that distance, had been detected by civilian observatories within hours, and the public information environment was moving fast. There were also voices arguing for silence. For simply watching and waiting. Adeyemi argued for neither. A protest tells them we're rattled. Silence tells them we're uncertain. What we need to tell them is that we noticed, we understand what it means, and we've already thought past it. The response he proposed was a single transmission, sent not as an emergency communication but through the standard diplomatic channel they had established at the summit, the channel used for procedural and administrative exchanges. It read in full: we have noted the repositioning of 3 Council-affiliated vessels in the outer solar system. We interpret this as a continuity of contact measure and acknowledge it as such. We remain available for scheduled diplomatic communication per agreed protocols. If the Council wishes to discuss the parameters of acceptable vessel positioning during the ongoing dialogue period, we are prepared to add this to the next formal session agenda. No threat. No demand. No panic. Just, we see you, we know what you're doing, and we've already decided it doesn't change anything. Seth Ravel read the transmission twice. The Dururan security specialist, who had been running probability assessments since the vessel repositioning, updated his models. They didn't move any defensive assets, he said. No fleet repositioning. No increased energy signatures from orbital infrastructure. No change in communication traffic patterns. Meaning? Meaning either they genuinely aren't concerned, or they're better at concealing their concern than any species we've documented. He paused. Or meaning there's a third category I don't have a model for. Which is that they responded diplomatically because diplomacy is genuinely what they prefer. Not as a tactic. As a first choice. He rechecked his instruments. The problem is that in every species we've processed, first-choice diplomacy correlates with limited military capacity. But their archive doesn't support limited military capacity. Seth Ravel set down the transmission record. They're not choosing diplomacy because they can't fight. No. They're choosing it because they think it's more effective. She stood and walked to the chamber's observation port. Outside, the distant smear of the Milky Way core ran across a field of cold stars. Somewhere in that direction, too far to see, was a small yellow star with an improbable planet orbiting it at exactly the right distance. Convene the full council, she said. This requires a proper deliberation. The full council session was attended by representatives of all 14 member species. It lasted 3 days. The core debate was simple but without easy resolution. Humanity had failed to comply with the summons, had refused standard classification, had declined to disclose military assets, and had responded to a show-of-presence maneuver with calm diplomatic correspondence. Under any standard model, this combination of behaviors was either extreme confidence or elaborate performance. The Military Assessment Division presented their analysis of what humanity's defense capability likely was, based on indirect evidence. Energy output signatures from lunar installations, the scale and complexity of their orbital infrastructure, the characteristics of the few vessels they had deployed publicly, and, most significantly, the rate of technological development their monitoring had tracked over the past 40 years. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Humanity's military capability was uncertain. The Council simply didn't have direct data, but the indicators were consistent with a species that had been developing defensive infrastructure as if it expected eventual contact with a peer-level threat for at least 60 years. Not reactive. Not improvised. Anticipated. They've been building for this, the Mora analyst said. Not building to attack. Building to not lose. The room was quiet. There's a difference, Seth Ravel said. There is. An attacking force builds for projection. What we're seeing in their infrastructure signatures is depth. Redundancy. Resilience. They've been building a system that's very hard to break, not one that's particularly easy to use offensively. He pulled up a comparison chart. It's similar to what we saw in the Veth species' early period before they joined the Council. Except the human version is more extensive. The Veth delegate's expression, rendered in the flickering way her species communicated subvocal reactions, could only be described as, "I find that personally concerning." On Earth, Adeyemi was called into a secure briefing with Admiral Huang and the Joint Defense Council. The intelligence picture they were sharing with him was not public, would not become public for many years, and was not entirely comfortable. The Council's vessels had moved again. Not closer. But there were 5 of them now. They're being careful, Huang said. Every movement is technically outside any boundary we've defined. They're not giving us a clear casus belli. Because they don't want one yet, Adeyemi said. They want to see if we'll draw the line ourselves. Will we? Adeyemi looked at the display. Yes. But we draw it the way we've done everything else in this process. Clearly. Calmly. Without hysteria. He turned to the Admiral. I need to know something and I need an honest answer. Not a political one. Huang met his eyes. Ask. If this escalates, if they push past what we can accept diplomatically, can we actually back up what we've been implying? The Admiral was quiet for 3 seconds. We've been building for 60 years, he said. Not because we knew it would be them. But because we knew it would be someone. He looked back at the display. We're not invincible. We're not even certain to win every engagement. But we can make the cost of a confrontation with us high enough that no rational actor would consider it worthwhile. He paused. The question has always been whether they're rational. Adeyemi nodded slowly. Then we hold the line, he said. Diplomatically for as long as possible. But we make sure they know the line exists. The Council vessels held their position for 11 days. On the 12th day they withdrew to a point outside the solar system. No explanation was given. None was asked for. Both parties understood what had happened. The Council had tested the line. Humanity had held it. The bluff they had assumed they were facing had not, in fact, been a bluff at all. Not everyone in the Galactic Council wanted conflict. This was something that Earth's diplomatic team had suspected from the early transmissions, based on subtle variations in the Council's official language, the way certain phrases appeared to have been softened between drafts, The way the original summons had been firm but not threatening, but it wasn't confirmed until a secondary channel opened up 11 weeks into the standoff. The message came through a frequency adjacent to the official diplomatic band. It was brief, encoded in a cipher that was technically more consistent with Council's scientific communication protocols than with their diplomatic ones, and it was signed, as best as the linguistics team could render, by a designation belonging to the VETH delegate's office. Not from Seth Ravel directly. From someone in her office. The message said, "There are parties within the continuance who believe the current engagement protocol is a mistake. They do not represent a majority position. But they are not without influence. The human delegation should understand that the Council's posture is not monolithic." Adeyemi read it in the early morning, in the quiet of the Leiden facility's briefing room, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He read it again. Then he called Nkosi. "It's real," Nkosi said 40 minutes later, after she had reviewed the original encoding and the linguistic markers. "The cipher structure is consistent with internal Council communications, not something fabricated for external consumption. And the content is too specific to be disinformation. Why send it? Because whoever sent it wants us to know that pushing back is working. That our non-compliance, our steadiness, is creating fractures inside the Council's coalition." She set down the analysis sheet. "Think about it from their perspective. 14 member species, each with their own interests, their own histories with the Council's authority. Most of them have been under Council governance long enough to have built institutional loyalty. But some of them remember what their own first contact looked like. The VETH themselves, Seth Ravel's own species, were incorporated into the Council under pressure. She knows what compliance under duress looks like. And she's not comfortable watching us face the same thing. She might not be. Or it might be someone below her who isn't. But either way," Nkosi tapped the message, "this tells us the Council isn't unanimous and they want us to know it." Adeyemi thought for a long moment. "Do we respond?" "Carefully. Through the same channel. Something that acknowledges receipt without confirming that we're treating it as an official back channel. We don't want to compromise whoever sent this." "And in the main negotiation?" Nkosi almost smiled. "We keep doing exactly what we've been doing. Because it's working." The fractures on Earth were less subtle and considerably louder. The public information environment had been a managed challenge since contact day 1, but by the 4th month of the standoff, it had become something more complex. Every major government had its own communication strategy, its own domestic political pressures, and its own interpretation of what the Council's presence in the outer solar system meant for their citizens. In 3 countries, parliamentary motions had been introduced demanding full public disclosure of the Council's transmissions. In 2 others, political movements had emerged arguing that humanity should simply accept the Council's original terms, that the risk of continued defiance wasn't worth the cost. And in several quiet corners of the internet and academic community, a different concern was being raised. What if humanity's confidence wasn't as well-founded as the diplomatic team implied? What if the posture of calm non-compliance was a performance that would eventually be called? Commander Voss found herself fielding questions from the Defense Coordination Council that she hadn't expected to be answering at this stage. Questions about what an actual military confrontation with the Council would look like, what the realistic casualty projections were, and whether the 60 years of quiet infrastructure building that Admiral Huang kept referencing was actually sufficient for a scenario no one had ever planned for in explicit terms. She answered honestly, which was not entirely reassuring. "We've run simulations," she told the Council. "Based on what we know of their vessel configurations, their weapons signatures, and our own defensive capabilities. The results are..." She paused, choosing precision over comfort. "Not catastrophic. But they're not comfortable either. We would take damage. Significant damage. The question is whether the damage we could inflict in return would make the cost prohibitive for them. And would it? Our best assessment is yes. But that assessment depends on behavioral assumptions about Council decision-making that we can't fully verify." She met the eyes of the people in the room. "We've never seen them fight. We don't know how they respond to losses. We know how we do." The room was quiet with the specific weight of people understanding that the stakes had always been real. Back in the outer reaches of the solar system, the Council's remaining observation vessel, one had stayed behind after the main group withdrew, was detecting something unusual. Earth's orbital infrastructure was changing. Not dramatically. Not in any way that could be called mobilization. But the energy signatures from several lunar installations were shifting in patterns consistent with systems coming online after long periods of reduced operation. The deep space relay arrays were showing increased communication traffic. Not unusual, but the frequency profiles were consistent with long-range targeting calibration. The Dururan security specialist filed a report. His conclusion: the human species appears to be moving its defensive systems from maintenance posture to readiness posture. This is not offensive preparation. It is a species that has decided the period of purely diplomatic engagement may be nearing its limit and is ensuring its defensive infrastructure is current. Seth Ravel read the report and thought about the human negotiator's expression during the summit, the careful stillness of it, the way he had never once shown urgency, as if he had already modeled how long this would take and was simply working through the time. She sent a message to the Council's deliberation chamber. It said, "I am requesting formal authority to pursue a modified engagement protocol. The current approach is not producing compliance and appears to be producing the opposite effect. I believe we are misreading this species' decision-making framework and that continuing on the current path carries escalating risk." The reply took 2 days. It granted partial authority. Enough to initiate a new round of talks, but with explicit Council instructions that the core terms, formal classification, military disclosure, territorial acknowledgement, remained non-negotiable. Seth Ravel read the reply carefully. Then she sent a transmission to the Human Diplomatic Facility in the Netherlands. It began, "We propose a resumption of direct dialogue." The Council's internal fractures were not yet a split. Earth's internal doubts were not yet a crisis. But both parties were entering the next phase of this encounter having learned something fundamental. Neither side was as unified as it appeared. And neither side was as fragile as the other had hoped. The second round of talks was different in character from the first. Seth Ravel arrived with a smaller delegation, 2 advisors instead of 4, and without the Dururan security specialist. This was noted immediately by Nkosi, who relayed the observation to Adeyemi before the opening session began. "She's signaling a shift in tone," Nkosi said quietly. "The Dururan's absence removes the military assessment element from the visible team. She's framing this as a diplomatic conversation, not a security evaluation." Adeyemi nodded. "Then we meet her there." He had made his own adjustments. Commander Voss was not in the room for the opening session. The military advisors who had been present at the first summit were listed as available by Secure Link but were not physically present at the table. When Seth Ravel entered the meeting chamber and saw the configuration of the human delegation, there was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, that Adeyemi had learned to read as the Veth equivalent of recalibration. "Ambassador," she said through the translation interface. "Delegate," he replied. "We appreciate the initiative." The opening session was quieter than the first round. Less formal positioning, more direct exchange. Seth Ravel began by acknowledging, with a degree of candor that surprised everyone in the room, that the Council's initial engagement approach had been based on a model that had not adequately accounted for human behavioral patterns. She did not say we were wrong. What she said was closer to, "Our model required updating." Adeyemi accepted this without pressing the point. He understood that institutional acknowledgement of error, for a body as old as the Council, was a significant act even when framed carefully. The question that changed everything came in the third session on the second day. Seth Ravel had been reviewing the compact proposal, the mutual observation framework that Adeyemi had introduced at the first summit, and had been working through its implications with a methodical thoroughness that he had come to recognize as characteristic of her approach. She did not dismiss ideas. She examined them from multiple angles, identified their weakest points, and then asked the question that the weakest point implied. The question she asked in the third session was this: "Why didn't you accept our terms?" Not as a challenge. Not as a rhetorical device. As what appeared to be a genuine inquiry. Adeyemi considered his answer for almost 15 seconds. A long time in a diplomatic exchange, but he had decided early in this process that visible consideration was more credible than instant response. "Because your terms assumed a relationship we don't accept," he said. "Not because we don't respect the Council's history or its role, but because the terms were structured around an authority we had never recognized and a classification we had never consented to. Accepting them would have established a precedent, that humanity's status in this community is something others define for us rather than something we negotiate as participants." Seth Ravel was quiet for a moment. "Most species," she said, "do not think about it in those terms. The Council offers stability, security. The terms are the price of membership." "We understand that," Adeyemi said. "And we're not opposed to membership. We're opposed to the terms being non-negotiable." Why? It was such a simple question. Such a direct one. He looked across the table at her, an entity from a species that had been part of a galactic institution longer than human civilization had practiced writing, and felt the strange weight of the moment fully. Because we've been here before, he said. Not with you. With each other. And every time one group of humans told another group of humans that the terms were non-negotiable and the only question was compliance, it ended badly. For everyone. He paused. We learned, slowly and at great cost, that durable agreements require willing parties. We're offering you that. A willing party. But only on terms we've actually agreed to. Nkosi had given him the historical framing. But the words were his. And the silence that followed them was the longest silence in any of their sessions. When Sethravel finally spoke, she said, You have significant conflict in your history. Internal conflict. Species-on-species conflict. Yes. How did you survive it? It was not the question he had expected. He looked at her, at the careful, measured attention in her manner, and understood that this was the real inquiry. Not a challenge. Not a trap. A genuine attempt to understand something the Council's archive, with all its 47,000 volumes, had apparently not explained. Not always gracefully, he said. We didn't survive every version of ourselves. A lot of us didn't make it. A lot of cultures, languages, ways of life, they're gone. We carry that. He thought for a moment. But the parts that survived mostly survived because they were harder to permanently break than they were to temporarily damage. Because they kept finding ways to adapt, to rebuild, to, sometimes against every rational expectation, continue. That is not a strategic doctrine, she said. That is a psychological disposition. Yes, he agreed. I think it is. That evening, in the private record she kept in her personal archive, not filed with the Council, not part of any official documentation, Sethravel wrote something that she would later describe as the most honest assessment she had produced in 212 years of diplomatic service. She wrote, The humans are not a threat in the way we modeled. They are not an empire in formation. They are not a predatory species with concealed expansionist intent. They are something we have no category for. A species that has survived itself repeatedly and has developed, through that survival, a form of confidence that is not aggression and a form of resilience that is not recklessness. The Council's error was in treating their non-compliance as either a bluff or a provocation. It was neither. It was an expression of how they actually function. The question we should have asked first, the question I asked today far too late, was not what are their military capabilities, but what do they want? The answer is surprisingly simple. They want to be here. In this community. On equal terms. Not dominance. Not exemption. Equal terms. I am not certain the Council knows how to offer that. We have not done it before. But I am increasingly certain that learning how may be necessary. The archive of 61 first contact cases had one thing in common. Every species the Council had processed had wanted something. Safety, resources, protection, status. The Council had learned to manage want. Humanity wanted something the Council had not been asked to provide in 4,000 years. Partnership. And they were, with considerable patience and no small amount of quiet capability, waiting for the Council to figure out what to do with that. The formal signing of the Mutual Recognition Accord took place 247 days after the first Council transmission arrived at the Atacama Array. It was not signed aboard a Council vessel. It was not signed on Earth. It was signed in the same orbital facility where the second round of talks had concluded, the joint construction that still floated at the midpoint between humanity's home and the Council's advanced position, a structure built by two engineering teams who had spent 3 days figuring out how to work alongside each other before anyone had exchanged a single diplomatic word. The ceremony was modest. Both parties had agreed, during the final negotiation sessions, that the signing should not be made into a spectacle. No live broadcast. No staged imagery of clasped hands or bowed heads. A working session that concluded with signatures, or their species equivalent, on a document that had gone through 41 drafts and incorporated input from 89 human governments and all 14 Council member species. Adeyemi signed for humanity. Sethravel signed for the Council. Neither of them made a speech. The Mutual Recognition Accord was not a perfect document. Both parties knew this, and both parties said so in the preamble, a choice that had been controversial on both sides, with voices arguing that acknowledging imperfection in a treaty undermined its authority. Adeyemi had argued the opposite, that a document which pretended to resolve everything would be less durable than one that honestly acknowledged the limits of what it was doing. The accord established several things. First, humanity's status as a recognized autonomous civilization in galactic community, not a Council associate, not a provisional member, but a recognized entity with full standing to engage in diplomatic, scientific and commercial exchange with Council members and non-Council species alike. Second, a bilateral observation framework, running for an initial period of 30 Earth years, during which both parties would maintain dedicated communication channels, share non-sensitive scientific data, and conduct a joint review every 5 years of the relationship's development. Third, a mutual non-interference clause that explicitly covered humanity's solar system and a defined territorial buffer beyond it, with the same protection applied to the Council's 3 closest inhabited systems. Fourth, a provision that had not been in any of the Council's standard templates, had been introduced by the human delegation in the final week of negotiations, and had generated more internal Council debate than any other element, an accession pathway clause, establishing that any species contacted by either party independently, and meeting jointly agreed criteria for autonomous civilizational status, could request full recognition under the Accord rather than being subject to unilateral classification. This clause was the one that the Council's more conservative members had fought hardest against. It was the one that Seth Ravel had fought hardest for. It passed. The implications of the Accord took time to process, even for the people who had built it. Dr. Nkosi returned to Cape Town and spent 2 weeks writing nothing before she wrote the essay that would eventually be considered the defining early analysis of humanity's first contact outcome. Its central argument was simple, that humanity's position in the galaxy had not been secured by military deterrence alone, or by diplomatic skill alone, but by the combination of the two in a ratio that most observers, including apparently the Council, had not anticipated. The deterrence had been real. The 60 years of quiet infrastructure building, the orbital platforms, the deep space detection arrays, the redundant communications architecture, all of it had contributed to a defensive posture that made aggression against humanity a genuinely costly proposition. The Council's Military Assessment Division had modeled it correctly, not invincible but expensive. But the deterrence had been the floor, not the ceiling. What had actually driven the outcome was the diplomatic decision to treat the Council not as a threat to be managed but as a relationship to be built, carefully, with clear limits, and from a position of enough quiet confidence that the building didn't require either submission or bluster. The Council expected a species that would either fold or escalate, Nkosi wrote. We did neither. We negotiated. As equals. With patience. And with enough substance behind the patience that walking away from the table was never their most attractive option. Commander Voss was promoted. She found the promotion somewhat uncomfortable, given that the outcome had been a diplomatic one rather than a military one, and she said so in the brief remarks she made at the ceremony. The work we did wasn't fought, she told the assembled officers. It was supported. Our job was to make sure that when our diplomats sat across from something older and larger and more established than anything we'd ever faced, they had enough foundation beneath them to speak clearly. She paused. That's not a small job. That's the whole job. Making it possible for people to negotiate without fear. We did that. I'm proud of it. Admiral Huang, sitting in the front row, quietly agreed. The Galactic Council's internal history of the Accord, compiled over the decade following the signing, drawn from multiple member species records, described it in measured but clear terms as the first treaty in Council history negotiated to full bilateral mutual recognition from a position of initial non-compliance by the contacted species. The VETH delegate's personal archive, portions of which were eventually shared with human diplomatic historians under the terms of the scientific exchange program that grew out of the Accord, contained a single entry from the night the document was signed. It read, "We processed 61 species. The 62nd taught us something about what processing means. I am uncertain whether this is a failure of our model or evidence that the model was working correctly, that we have, in fact, maintained the order we were designed to maintain, but have done so by encountering a species capable of improving that order rather than simply conforming to it. I think I prefer this outcome. I did not expect to. On Earth, life resumed. Not unchanged. The scope of what had happened was too large for it to be otherwise. But what the public eventually settled into was not the triumphant narrative that some media environments had tried to build, humanity defeats alien council, nor the anxious one that others had pushed, we barely survived. What settled was something more accurate and, in its accuracy, more durable. A recognition that the species that had sent steam engines and atomic flashes and lonely Voyager probes drifting into the dark had, when the dark sent something back, responded with something that was neither rage nor fear. It had responded with the thing it had learned, across thousands of years of fighting itself, was actually more powerful than either. Considered, principled, eyes-open engagement. Not perfect. Not without cost. Not without the quiet, steady weight of 60 years of preparation running underneath it. But real. The first human vessel to travel under formal diplomatic clearance through Council-recognized space launched 14 months after the accord was signed. It was a research ship, small, crewed by 21 scientists and 3 diplomats, equipped for long-range observation and cultural exchange rather than military engagement. Its mission profile was 18 months. It returned after 22. The lead scientist filed a report that contained, among many other things, a sentence that was eventually quoted in more places than she had intended when she wrote it. We went out expecting to be assessed. We came back having been understood. These are not the same thing, and the difference matters more than I can easily articulate. 247 days. 41 drafts. 6,000 years of accumulated human history informing every word. The Council had thought humanity was bluffing. They had been wrong. But what they had been wrong about was subtler and more important than a military miscalculation. They had been wrong about what kind of species this was. Humanity hadn't won by being stronger. It had won by being, in the deepest sense, exactly what it had always tried, imperfectly, persistently, across centuries of its own conflicts and failures and recoveries, to become. A species that showed up. And didn't back down. And asked in the end not for dominance, but for a seat at the table.